Each day I'll do a golden deed by helping those who are in need. My life on earth is but a span, and so I'll do the best I can. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, then I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. To be a child of God each day, my life must shine along the way. I'll sing His praise while it is rolled, and strive to have some trouble soul. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, then I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. The only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and pure. And so for God, I'll take my stand. Each day I lend a helping hand. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, then I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. While going down life's weary road, I'll try to live some traveler's load. I'll try to turn the night to day, make flowers bloom along the way. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, then I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, then I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun.
Morning. Appreciate those songs, Greg. They really do put us in the mood for being with God and His people. It's been an interesting week. I appreciate your patience, many of you. We made a quick trip. kind of at the last minute, back to Chicago. We did. We saw the Chi-Town, they call it. That's Jim's place. Our grandson was born Thursday morning. So, a little bit tight shirt here today. And yes, we have pictures, just in case you wonder. Everybody's doing fine now. There was a bit of trauma there, but everybody's doing well. I appreciate your prayers. We're going to be a little scatterbrained here for a few weeks, though, with that news coming down. It's been a good week, though, and I appreciate everybody being here today, including our visitors who are with us. And we appreciate you sharing your time, honoring us with your presence as we worship God together. Good time of song and singing. Appreciate the prayers today, the thoughts at the Lord's Supper. Everything was well attuned. We're in tune with God. And that's a spirit thing, isn't it? That's God's Spirit working within each one of us. And that really is what we're talking about this year. You remember a couple of years ago when we first came here, we talked about knowing God. That's what God through Jeremiah says He wants people to boast about, that you know me, but the right way. And so we spent the year talking about knowing God. Last year, Paul just wanted to know Christ, the power of that resurrection. Last year we talked about Jesus and what He was here for, what His purpose was and still is. And this year we're looking at the work of God through His Spirit, the Spirit that abides right inside each one of us. We're baptized into Christ, we're clothed with Christ, and the Spirit is poured in as an ever-present presence of God within our lives. Because if we're ever alone, just for a moment, we're not going to make it. Only with God will we get out of here alive. And that's really what we're looking for. So that's what we're looking at this year. And this month especially is how the Spirit empowered God's people to do what was necessary, to do what was humanly impossible. But with God, remember, all things are possible. And so, Hebrews chapter 10, I've had that at the heading of your handout. If you don't have a handout, I think there's more back on the table there, inside on the green slip of paper inside your bulletin. It's a handout you can follow along if you wish to. And I do want to remind you, too, that on our website, which is in your bulletin, the web page, on the teaching page, there is a list of links that you can click on if you weren't able to be here. Adrian records each week, and I've downloaded those on our YouTube page, so you can watch the sermon. If you can't sleep at night, put you right out. That's a little joke there. Maybe not. This month we're looking at the empowerment. And God doesn't just empower a few. Now, Peter gave the promise in Acts chapter 2. It's for everybody. Not just select individuals. Now, in the age where Christ's blood has brought sanctification, justification, it's everybody. God will give the strength to do whatever has to be done. And so in Hebrews chapter 10, I'll leave that to you, or for former outlines that you have to read about that. The letter of Hebrews was written to Christians who were really going through a hard time of persecution. And it shouldn't be that way. But the key word is should. Because Satan will see to it that if you're a threat, he's going to threaten you. If you're doing what is right, that's a threat. And so controversy, problems are not a sign that things are wrong. Right. It may be a sign that you're a threat to the enemy. And so there's the encouragement there to keep going, to keep trying. And as I said before, faith that's needed to endure to the end is difficult. It isn't easy. When someone says, just have a little faith, smile, nod your head, understand, but they don't know what they're talking about. Faith is difficult. Your enemy will see to it. But with God, a whole lot easier. The faith that's to endure to the end is difficult to achieve. It's difficult to get. It's there, but humanly impossible on your own to achieve. Also, it's difficult to maintain. Keep going. That's what the Spirit's work is today within each one of us. is to help us maintain it. And it's difficult to mature or to grow. And that is what God is expecting. Remember the parable of the 1-talent man? He gave back to the master exactly what the master gave to him. He thought he'd be praised for bringing it back just with unmarred, untouched, and he was called wicked and lazy. Those other guys, you have to imagine just what it went through for them. They played with the Lord's money. They risked it in the open market. But that's what made it grow. And that's what God is expecting for us too. And it's going to be difficult, and we need God's help. Therefore, the Holy Spirit is given to the saved to help us to achieve it, maintain it, and to mature it. That's God's love for you. I appreciate Jeffrey's words today about how much he went through for you. He shows how much he cares with that. The book of Acts, the New Testament letter, book of Acts, was written to us to show us how God's Spirit will work within each one of us. Because those were ordinary guys. They were ordinary people. They were from just ordinary walks of life. They weren't extraordinary until God was allowed to work in their life and do extraordinary things. And He'll do the same for you. You don't have to be superhuman. It doesn't take a great deal of intelligence. It just takes a willingness to work with God. The book of Acts has been called lately, it's usually the Acts of the Apostles, but not all of them are talked about. Not everything they did is talked about, so they were saying some of the Acts of some of the Apostles. That got too long. They just shortened it to the Acts, which hopefully then you can see where you fit in there. That's everybody. But really the one working is God's Spirit. So it has been called lately the Acts of the Holy Spirit. Is a good term, a good title for the second part of Luke's Gospel. Luke part 2. Because all throughout the book of Acts in the New Testament, the power of God's Spirit is present in everything that's going on. Talked about the ordinary Christians a couple weeks ago. Last week, talked about the apostles, especially James, who gave his life. Peter, who was released from prison, but yet also empowered to be bold and courageous after he had denied Jesus. What was it that brought him back? It was God's Spirit within him. And this week then, we'll look at what the main character of the book of Acts. Most of the book of Acts is about one apostle who at first was not an apostle, a persecutor of the church. Thinking he was doing God's will, he was persecuting the Christians as being heretics to the true faith. He truly believed they were destroying the work of God. And that by eliminating them, getting them out of the way, you've taken away that evil influence. And now he's turned around and he's playing for the other team. In your handout, in your bulletin on the front page, there is a discussion about how dangerous a traitor is. He knows all your secrets. He knows what you're doing. I remember in the past, one of the NFL teams, the quarterback was traded from one team to the other. He's on the sidelines telling the coach what these guys are going to do. He was doing it, so he knows. And that's the fear of traitors. And Paul to them was a traitor. Saul of Tarsus at first, after being empowered by the Spirit and seeing him work in his life, his name changed to Paul. Interesting, in English it's just changing of the first letter. But Shaul was his first name, that's in Hebrew, which was a very honorable name. Someone who is honored by God, highly honored, a favorable person. Changed to the Greek name Paulus, which means little and insignificant. So from Hebrew to Greek, you have total opposites. Even though in English, just changing of the first letter. But that shows his character. Before, he was all high on himself. Afterwards, he realized how insignificant he really was. And only by God's grace and the power of God's Spirit was he able to accomplish anything. And the book of Acts, written by one of his students. Luke was part of the mission team. You see that when he's headed to Philippi after Acts chapter 20. No? I'll have to check that. They're headed from Troas into Philippi. And the narrative now, instead of saying Paul and Barnabas or Paul and Silas did this, they went there, they did. Now it's we went in. We talked to the people. See, Luke now was part of the mission team. And so the rest of his book is about his experience with his teacher in Christianity, that being Paul. And so we see how God's Spirit was working through Saul of Tarsus, later Paul the Apostle, all throughout the book of Acts, and in some of his letters too, Paul discusses God's working in his life. First of all, on the road to Damascus. The city of Damascus, which is still inhabited and still functioning today. The oldest habitation thought of on the face of the earth. On the road to Damascus, he was going to the northernmost outpost where he had heard there were some Christians there. We got to stop these people before they can escape. And on the road, a bright light. He heard Jesus' voice. And so it's thought the bright light that blinded him to drive him to his knees was God's Spirit. And the others who were with him, they were scared of what happened too. And for 3 days he was fasting and praying. You got to wonder what's going through his mind. How did I get this all wrong? Why didn't I see this before? Also in sending Ananias. Ananias was one of the Christians in town in Damascus. Ananias was approached by God. I want you to go to this guy's house. There's a guy there who's praying. He's waiting to learn what to do next. So I'm sending you, go see him. His name is Saul. He's from Tarsus. Hang on. Ananias, typical human, we think God needs more information, right? Do you know who this guy is? You're talking to God, aren't you? God really didn't answer. He said, no, go. Go do what I've asked you to do. What faith it took for Ananias to face this guy who had come to town to kill them and yet was willing to do it. Who gave him the strength, the power, the courage? God's Spirit. And that night, Saul was baptized into Christ and began preaching right away. He boldly proclaimed the faith that he had once tried to destroy. You see that in Acts chapter 9. That's what's in parentheses there in your handout. That's actually what he himself said that people talked about him. Yeah, they only know that the one who tried to destroy the faith is now preaching for them. He's the turncoat. He's the traitor. He's the spy. And that's how he was thought of in Jerusalem. Because later, some of the Jews tried to kill him. Now that he'd traded sides, ran back to Jerusalem, and the Christians there weren't willing to take him in. They knew all about this guy. And so through the Spirit, Barnabas was inspired to vouch for him. What faith and courage it took Barnabas to stand up for this guy. But for his name's sake, he lived it out. Barnabas. Bar, son of. Nabas means to lift people up, to encourage them. And that's what the apostles named him. His real name was Joseph. Barnabas stood up for Paul. Who gave him the courage to do it? Who stepped in right when Saul needed it? It was the Spirit who moved him, urged him to do that for him. Later on, he went back home into Asia. What he was doing there, he was relearning God's ways in Asia. He talks about this in the book of Galatians, the letter of Galatians. Because a lot of people claim that he got his gospel from the other apostles. No, he said, I got direct revelation right from Jesus himself. But what faith it took for him to unlearn everything he had always been taught. Even today, people have difficulty when you try to show them what the Bible really says. I've had difficulty. I can imagine a whole world view having to be changed. And yet he was willing to do it. For years he was home, unlearning, relearning. And he was getting that from God's Spirit. He was getting that encouragement, that courage, that willingness to do it. Later on, the early Christians were headed north. They started preaching to Gentiles, non-Jews. The disciples didn't know what to do with that. We think that's kind of funny today. They didn't know the gospel was supposed to be for Gentiles too. And so they sent some people north. They sent Barnabas to check it out, and he loved it. But he knew they needed someone who knew the culture, understood their background and their worldview to help him out. And so he went into Asia to a city called Tarsus, found his friend, Saul, and brought him back. And so in Antioch then, he was working with Barnabas in the city of Antioch for a year and a half. Learning now to put into practice and train and mentor others what he had just relearned the right way this time. So again, if it weren't for Barnabas, where would we be? Barnabas was willing, though, to expend himself. Who gave him the courage? Who gave him the insight? That was God's Spirit helping him there. And then through 3 missionary tours that we know of. Luke shows 3 different times Paul now was sent out to preach and to teach. And they didn't have Motel 6 with the light left on for you. When you traveled in groups, and your life depended on the people that were with you. Think about the westward expansion in our history and what it took people for months to travel across the country, across mountains. You're with a group of people you may not like. Check out sometime, you can do it on Netflix. Check out an old Paul Newman movie called Hombre, where he was hired as a wagon master to drive some people across to the west, and he hated those people. You can imagine what it was like to have this group of people. You had to depend on them, like them or not. Yeah, and that's really what the church is made up of, isn't it? We don't get to pick and choose. We're not told to create unity. We're commanded to maintain it. Because there are people that are put in your life that you may not care for. You may not care for me. Understandable. That's what we're called to do, though. We depend on each other. If we let each other down, we're not going to make it. None of us. And that's what Paul had to deal with those 3 missionary tours. So you can understand a little bit why he got so miffed when Mark turned around and went home. That went part of the night watch. You might not get so much sleep now. Paul was very upset with that. But he was learning as well. And throughout those chapters there with the 3 tours that Luke records for us, we can see where the Spirit was helping him in his preaching. Because now he's learning to understand just what Jesus was here for, what God was planning all along. And now he was trying to get not just his Jewish brethren to relearn it the right way, but now the people who really didn't even have the background, the Gentiles. And he didn't have a New Testament to fall back on like we do. It was still being written. So it took a lot of faith for him to do that. Also in his healing, he always gave credit to God for the things that he was doing. The controversies that came up, Paul would have been a difficult man to work with. And it shows especially with the history of the Corinthian church, where he made a lot of enemies on the inside, just with trying to keep them on the right path. They kicked him out. He had to send Timothy in to smooth it up, and Timothy couldn't do it. He sent Titus, who must have been a really tough dude. But he got things in shape. And Paul breathed a sigh of relief in 2 Corinthians. We got through that. Not from my doing, no. You got to see where Paul had the controversy. And he also had the persecution. How did he face the Jews dragging him into court and all the other things that were going wrong? that we think we're going wrong. It was really Satan feeling threatened, trying to get him to quit. Through God's Spirit, he was able to do that. Once he was stoned and left for dead. Some, I don't know if you want to believe this or not, it's up to you. Doesn't really say it one way or the other. Some think he was actually stoned to death. He was killed. But as they gathered in to see how he was doing, revived. Doesn't say. But still, what did he do right after that? Went back into town, started preaching again. It didn't stop him. What gave him the strength to do that? It's not human. You got to know that was God's Spirit. Chapter 15 talks about the Jerusalem Council, as it's called, where the leaders of the church met to decide what to do with Gentiles. Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to become Jews before they can be? And it was Paul and Barnabas and James who stood up and said, no. That's part of the first covenant. We have a new outlook on life now. The cleansing of the blood of Christ. And then the letter that they sent out, it says, it seemed good to us and to the Spirit not to put any more burden on you. So in the Jerusalem Council, helping them, guiding them with their decisions, their practices. Chapters 21 through 28, Paul is unjustly imprisoned. Thrown into prison for trying to help people. Time and time again. He helped the girl. Of course, her owners weren't happy with that. Tossed him in the pokey. But at midnight, the jail cell broke open. And the jailer, listening to him sing at night. You don't hear prisoners singing in a dungeon. And now he and his family then were baptized into Christ that night because of that. So he's even working, though unjustly imprisoned. Who could do that? Would you sing with your back torn up with whips and stuff and then feet locked in stocks and laying on a dirt floor? Is that a good time for singing, Greg? What gave him the strength to do that? Gave him the courage. That was God's Spirit. Now, he was constantly on trial after that, standing before councils. Now, there were assassination plots. Some very, very hungry individuals who claimed they weren't going to eat and drink until they killed him. They got very skinny if they kept their vows. Also, according to the book of Acts, a shipwreck as well. Terrifying event. Out on the open sea, not able to know even where they were going. And yet, God, through His Spirit, keeping Paul encouraged so that he could encourage the others. And you know, he was shaking in his boots too. Then on the island, he was bit by a snake. And the natives of the culture there said, see, he escaped the sea gods, and now he's not going to get away with it. And they watched him and watched him and watched. When he didn't shrivel up and die, they said, he must be a god. That's how fickle people are, aren't they? Yeah, but that was God working through him. And then finally, in the last chapter, he's in Rome, preaching the gospel there. The encouragement he received from the Christians, churches were already established there. They came to greet him at the shore. And who do you think sent those Christians to encourage him? That's some ways in which God, through His Spirit, answers prayer by sending us to encourage and to help. He was then able to boldly preach the gospel. He was able to prove with the first covenant, the law and the prophets is what they called it. He was able to prove with the Old Testament that Jesus was the Christ. So it has all the information you need to prove that Jesus was God's Messiah. That's what he used. Tradition has it that he was released at that time and traveled to Spain, where he preached. He wrote the letter to the Romans, actually long before his imprisonment, saying, I'm going to stop by and visit you, and then you can help me financially as I go to Spain. Rather impetuous guy, wasn't he? You're going to help me financially. You're going to give me money. Erasmus would have liked that guy. Yeah. And then it's thought that he did great mission work out at the edge of the world Because to them, the known world, that was the end. The Romans saw some islands out there off the coast and went up to Great Britain for a while, but they thought that was the end of the world. And that's what Jesus wanted them to be witnesses for, to the ends of the earth. He did it. On his way back to meet with the Christians in Rome again, he was imprisoned. At that time, there was an Emperor Nero on the throne who was not likable to the Christians, and he was executed at that time. Executed for the cause of Christ, who gave him the courage to stand up in that, and in face of that issue there. Again, the Spirit. All throughout his life, at least written for us and recorded by Luke in his diary, that we call the book of Acts. You can see how God was working in Paul's life. And he'll work in your life too. Here's a description of some of the things that Paul says he went through. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul's reputation was on the line. There were a lot of people there boasting about all the great things they had done. And don't we usually today, we boast about our achievements, don't we? How many... Paul could have boasted, but he never did, about how many churches he established. He never boasted about how many people he'd baptized into Christ. In fact, he lost count. But he said, I didn't come to baptize, I came to preach. He didn't boast about how many he had mentored, like Timothy and Titus. He never boasted about the attendance, as some of my colleagues like to do. He boasted about what we would consider some very unlikely things. But what he boasted about was how God had worked through his life when it looked like he could not go on. And that, to him, showed his success. Look at some of these things and see if there would be enough that Satan could get you to quit. What anyone else dares to boast about, I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? NIV puts it in a little parentheses there. Paul didn't want to do this. I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I've worked much harder. Been in prison more frequently. Been flogged more severely. You can quit right there, and he's got me on every single one of those. He goes on. I've been exposed to death again and again. Verse 24, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Jewish law, when you were a criminal, was caught 40 lashes with a whip. But if you went over, now you got it. And so they would count to 39 and quit, just to make sure they didn't go over. So they called it the 40 minus 1, the 39. 5 times he got whipped publicly. 3 times I was beaten with rods. That could break a bone. Once I was stoned. And Luke recorded that for us. 3 times I was shipwrecked. We only know about 1. 3 times. I spent a night and day in the open sea. Is this a guy you want to hang out with? Want to be on this guy's mission team? I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. Sounds like a very successful ministry, wouldn't you say? I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who's weak and I do not feel weak? Who's led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I'll boast about the things that show my weakness. God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is to be praised forever, knows that I am not lying. And then almost as if feeling in disgrace is how I take it here. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of Damascenes guarded in order to arrest me. Did I stand up and stand for Christ? I was lowered in a basket from a window in a wall and slipped through his hands. Wish I could go back there and redo it again. That's what it seems like to me. Who humanly would go through that and keep going? If we train them in our schools today, wouldn't we say after the first 4 or 5, you know what, maybe this is a bit too dangerous for you. Let's go into another line of work. How many would want to be part of that mission team? This he's a magnet for trouble. And I've seen bulletin articles about him applying for a job to a church today, and they're thinking, this guy's nuts. You don't want a jailbird working for us? Yet that was his life. Why did he do that? He did it for the same reason that I remember waiting for my friend at lunch one time in Delhi near where we used to meet. And in the booth behind me, I couldn't see them. I could just hear them. Couple aged men. One of them said, "Hey, what was that there on your arm there? What's that?" Normandy. He said, "Oh yeah, hey, check it out. Take a look at this." He said, "Got this at Iwo Jima." The other guy says, "Yeah, look here. It's Battle of the Bulge." Do you know what they were doing? It didn't take me long to guess. Those are 2 World War II vets. They were showing their battle scars. Battle scars were proof that I put myself in danger and I didn't back down. I looked death in the face and I went after him. And I made it through to talk about it. Here's the proof. That's what Paul was doing. 2 Corinthians 11. He boasted about his battle scars. Because what they did was to prove his loyalty, his dedication. Didn't matter how many churches he started. Didn't matter how many people were baptized. Didn't matter how many were in attendance. I put my life on the line. And God brought me through so that I could tell you about it. And so he boasted about his battle scars, and he was daring the other critics, show me yours. Well, someone made fun of me the other day. Whoop-de-doo. Someone wouldn't let me stand in line and they refused me service. Whoop-de-doo. That's what Paul was doing. These battle scars proved that God's Spirit was infusing his life with power. And that's why Paul would boast about his weaknesses. Because that's when God took over. When he stepped aside. Because there was nothing else he could do. And no human could endure this without the Spirit's help. Nobody. And I pray, every time I read through that list, I pray, please don't make me go through any of that. But I know it's a possibility. Even in this country. It could happen. Am I ready? Am I willing? Or will Satan win and I'll give up? I pray I don't ever have to face it, or you. But it is something to think about. Later on in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, Paul talked about how much easier it would be if God would just take something away from him that was causing him so much trouble. Verses 7 through 10, 2 Corinthians 12. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations. And what he said before that, he was caught right up to God's throne. He said, I could boast about that. But I'm not going to. Because that won't do anything but make me look good. So I'm not going to do that. He said, to keep me from being conceited, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. That thorn is not what you find on the rose bush stem. That was a little dagger. That was used for secret slashings of people and enemies. Not necessarily to kill, but if handled correctly, you can make a person bleed out. It was just done to hurt and injure, maim them, slow them down until they finally bled to death. That's what Paul's using there. The thorn, the dagger in my flesh. And there's been a lot of debate as to what that was. It's open. Paul didn't say what it was because it's not important. Satan was allowed to inflict things on me to keep me humble. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. And God just does everything we want him to, doesn't he? God makes all the hurts feel better, doesn't he? He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. God said no. Because he liked to see Paul suffer? Because he likes to inflict pain? No, it's to make sure that Paul remembers who's in charge. And Paul learned the lesson so well that he can say, therefore I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power will rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I'm weak, that's when God comes and works. And who can stand against God? That's when I'm strong. We just don't see it that way, do we? That's just not a human way to look at things. He is now perfect in Christ. But to get there, there's a lot of trouble and a lot of trial. But notice what God says there. My grace is sufficient for you. We need nothing more in life than God's amazing grace. And that's it. Now, how many of you would remain faithful to God if the only blessing he ever gave you was the grace to keep your soul saved? Is that enough? Or do you need a nice car? A nice house? Health? A happy family? Now you know you got all that. But all you need is God's grace. Because he gives you not just enough. Not only just what you need. He goes over and above. Therefore, Paul can say in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Now, it doesn't mean he can do anything he wants. It's just whatever comes on for that day, he knows God's strength will get him through. God's Spirit will infuse us with power to handle anything that comes our way. That is a promise. God has never failed on a promise. He proved it by showing how he worked through an enemy of the gospel who was willing to change and become an advocate for the gospel. Now, if that's what he did with Saul, I don't know any of you that have been that mean to Christianity, have you? Don't tell me. You're nice people. If Paul can be infused with such power from God, imagine what good things we can do. And if he helped Paul through these terrible ordeals, he can get us through a ridicule, a verbal challenge, a time of making fun, having our rights taken away from us. God's Spirit will be with us too. God's Spirit will infuse us with the power to succeed whatever comes our way. So are you willing to let God work in your life that way? If you are and you're willing to have your sins cleansed, while we sing the song Greg has chosen, number 909, if you need to be baptized into Christ, we can do that. If you need prayers for strength, encouragement, or even to say thank you, so that we can see how God has been working in your life. And while we sing this song, we encourage that as well. Leave today knowing you're in God, you're in Christ, You're infused with His Spirit because you got some work to do. And if you're doing it right, Satan will attack you. You need God's strength to do it right. And if you need that, our help in that. And while we sing this song, please, let us help you. Let's stand while we sing.